Do you agree or disagree that homeschooling is better than school for socialization? Have at me. I want your most challenging questions and responses.
I've definitely seen the mixed age group phenomenon, and I think that's extremely healthy. Young kids develop faster when there are older kids around who see them as brothers, sisters, friends, take care of them, love them, etc. And so having kids of different ages mixed together is something that we evolved to do, but is really missing from the normal industrialized education system.
Naval, this is a good question, but I hesitate to answer because it's not a question that is answered easily. I think it really starts with family values, starting with what kind of parent do you want to be? Personally, what's worked for me is a non-coercive parenting style. I think we need to be very cautious about coercing our children to do anything. Keeping them from running into oncoming traffic, that's a good time to be a coercive parent. Homeschooling is not the time to be a coercive parent. What we want to be is a persuasive parent. Coercion is getting people to do something they do not want to do. Persuasion is helping people do something they themselves want to do. Homeschooling is a privilege. It's a choice, and it's not for everyone. And if a child does not want to be homeschooled, they want to go to conventional school, that's their right, and they should absolutely go to conventional school. I know video games can be very engaging, but let me tell you, in my experience, none of them compare to a child who is motivated to be homeschooled. If a child wants to be homeschooled, they will follow through. Now, this backs up to family values again. Let's define values. Values, in my book, in my definition, are attributes of the person you want to become. And this is something we've taught our daughter, who's been homeschooled since the first grade. And starting early is very important. We have to ask our children, what kind of person do they want to become, and help them make a schedule to fulfill their values. So perhaps one of the most important concepts we can teach our children is the idea of an opportunity cost. We don't want to terrify our children and tell them that technology is melting their brain or addicting them. That's ridiculous. What we want to do is to tell them that the price of using these technologies or overdoing it is what else you could be doing. Spending time with your friends, helping around the house, all the other things you want to do, that's the price. And by having a civil dialogue with them about how do they truly want to spend their time to live out their values, children that are very young, we had this conversation with my daughter when she was only 6 years old, can start making better decisions on how they want to spend their time. And that gives them back this autonomy to make their own decisions.
Yes, I love pairing teenage tutors with younger kids at Modulo because these kids respond so well to people who are just a little bit further along than them. They can really connect well with them and get inspired very easily. I would even go beyond mixed ages to say multi-generational. Shireen was talking about how her grandparents live with her in her home, and for children to have all these aunts and uncles and wise older people there to learn from is just so great for learning. There's so many insights to be had, and it's too bad that children sometimes have to wait until they're out of school to get exposed to these people who have so many years of knowledge from living on this planet. I used to assume, like many, that the best way for children to develop social skills was to be around other children. Seems normal enough. But then I read the book Hold On to Your Kids by Gabor Mate and Dr. Neufeld, and I discovered that culture, until recently, was always handed down vertically from generation to generation, and the emergence of this peer culture has actually only emerged in the last 50 years and is the source of many problems. I want to share a quote from the book. For the first time in history, young people are turning for instruction, modeling, and guidance, not to mothers, fathers, teachers, and other responsible adults, but to people whom nature never intended to place in a parenting role, their own peers. They are not manageable, teachable, or maturing because they no longer take their cues from us. Instead, children are being brought up by immature persons who cannot possibly guide them to maturity. They are being brought up by each other. Naval brought up a really great point that parents intuitively know how to educate their children. And this ability has evolved through billions of years of evolution. And yet we choose to outsource our children's education to someone else. We lack the confidence to do it ourselves. I'm curious for people here if you feel like you're competent enough to educate your children and choose not to, or if you don't for some other reason, or if you did choose to educate your child because you feel competent, and any other thoughts on this issue. Hey everybody, I just opened up this room so friends of friends can speak. Couple things. I want to have a real conversation here. So if you have objections to homeschooling or questions, please voice them. I don't want this to just be a rosy homeschooling is great no matter what conversation. And I also really want to get into the quality of homeschooling and approach to homeschooling instead of just staying stuck in should you do it or not. So hopefully people will chime in and we can have a really rich, deep conversation here. I just had a really interesting conversation with Dr. Gordon Neufeld, who wrote Hold On to Your Kids, and he encouraged me to talk about the social stuff as social capacity rather than learning social skills. To be social is not something that we learn, it's something we have a biological capacity for. And just like parents don't teach kids how to talk, it's about creating the conditions that allows that social capacity to flourish rather than teaching them how to behave or assuming that they'll learn those skills somewhere like school. And the fundamental condition is not being around other kids. It's that loving relationship we have with our parents that makes us feel secure and that allows us to go through the natural development that turns us into social people. So really, socialization, if that's what you want to call it, starts completely with the parent-child relationship and that being secure. It's not something we pick up from interacting with other kids. It's something we're born to do, just like talking.
Would you advocate for re-instructing handwriting? My son in first grade had a teacher who was my husband's first grade teacher. She was very, very old and could barely see. So he missed out on formative handwriting skills. Second grade teacher said, hey, that ship has sailed, but he'll be learning cursive and that will re-engage him with writing. That was true. She taught it, but then it was never reinforced. So his physical handwriting skills are just interesting. And so are a lot of his peer group. So I'm wondering, is this a skill that should be retaught? He's in high school now.
Wow, this is a toughie. I hope Shireen will jump in, but I'm just going to say I'd be curious to know what his needs and desires are. I mean, there are some people who say that handwriting is totally unnecessary, and then there are other kids who have a lot of shame because they go apply for a job and they need to fill out a form and they don't know how to write. He's definitely not alone in this. So I would start with the student and see what his needs and his desires are. And if that can be followed, if he has a motivation to learn handwriting, that's a good place to start. But certainly if there's a skill he needs and wants to learn, there's no reason not to start at the beginning and teach it again or help him where he left off. There are many different types of handwriting curricula, and finding the one that works best for him is a great way to begin, provided that this is a skill that he wants and needs to learn. That would be my main caveat. One more thing, Dawn. I wrote a rather in-depth blog on the purpose of handwriting and some of the different curricula out there and which work better for different types of children. I am going to copy and paste it in the comments. Maybe you'll find some useful insights there.
I agree with about 95% of this, but I don't agree with putting aside things that a child is not interested in. Sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes we can just deep dive and allow extra time for those passions. But I think the magic is when we can take those peripheral things or even those things that seem uninteresting and layer them into, spiderweb them into things the child is interested in and then make those connections, because there is very little we can't Kevin Bacon into another subject. I mean, math is related to everything. Science is related to everything. You can write about everything. So when a child says, "Oh, I don't like that," quite often they haven't had somebody enthusiastic instructing them. And so that's something big. I never knew the skills that would benefit me or the subjects that I would be using today. Many of them I would have discarded in a heartbeat if you just let me follow my interests. So that's something I feel strongly about, is just bringing the passion in and creating more interests. Thanks, Manisha. I'll take a look at that blog, definitely. I would say in response to your question, no, he's not interested. It was just something that I noticed recently because we were sitting down and I said, let's write together. And we wrote each of the letters, and just the way he started at a different point. I have standard, start, stop points for my handwriting, even though it's very, very, very messy. He would retrace over things, and it was just, he had learned the shapes of the letters, and they just kind of learned how to do it by themselves. So they are not efficient, and certainly there's no cursive involved. But I've actually always taken time when I taught. I would take time and teach kids how to handwrite, to fill out a form, and teach them how to develop a signature. We would spend a half hour, 45 minutes developing a unique signature, because that's something people will hold against you, even if you don't really need to write that much. So I taught them how to flourish. And this was actually a lesson I had in high school. Your handwriting should be unimpeachably unique to you. Brother Norris taught us how to do this in English class, and it was a lesson I passed on a generation later.
I'm sure some version of this has already been brought up, but I think it's very natural for kids and young people to want to be around other people their age. And with having kids being more and more uncommon, it's very sad seeing some of the kids I know not having friends their age until they enter school. So I think it's just nice once they are in school, they can have a lot of friends their age.
Hi, Timothy. Yes, we have talked about this topic extensively, as this is often the first thing that comes to mind when people think of homeschooling. But actually, homeschooling gives you the opportunity to curate your child's social life in the way that you feel is best for them. Homeschoolers hang out in diverse groups. They are friends with adults and friends with children of all ages. The groups are diverse. You can choose your friends. And the groups are smaller, so some really lovely social interaction can occur. I will also say that one of the big paradigm shifts in my thinking was when I realized how important the friendship between a parent and a child is. It's really only been in the last 50 years that we've started to think that the child's most important relationships are with other children their age, when in fact a loving relationship with a parent is what makes a child feel secure and happy and full, and also provides a foundation for all the other social relationships in their life. I'm sorry to hear that some of the kids didn't make friends until they went to school. Based on what, I think it's different for every child, but based on what I've read around child development, children really learn social cues from their parents until they're about ages 6 or 7. And certainly if a child is lonely, your parent can interact with them more. You can take them to a playground. There's lots of opportunities for social experiences. But all in all, most of the homeschoolers I know are super social. In fact, the most common complaint I hear is that their children's social calendars are overbooked, whereas in school, children typically only get 30 minutes of recess to play, if that. They don't really get to socialize when they're sitting at desks the rest of the day in school or in the loud, crowded lunchrooms. The other thing I would suggest is to search for the word socialization on AirChat. There's a pretty good search feature. Or go to the socialization topic. Naval and Alicia and others have said some really interesting things on this topic as it relates to homeschooling. There are two fundamental ideas in homeschooling, which once eluded me and are now as clear as day. Number one, children will learn if you don't teach them. That's what they were born to do. And secondly, parents have the natural capacity to support their children's learning. If you believe these two things, it's very strange to imagine that a child has to be taught all these memorization techniques by a trained teacher, or that someone who goes to teaching school would be able to raise your child better than you can. If we've dabbled in neuroscience at all, we know that children's brains are absolute sponges, and they acquire language naturally. And skills that they don't acquire naturally, like reading, when the conditions are right, they will ask to be taught them when they're ready. Even if you don't know about neuroscience, just watch a child asking why. They have this intense drive to learn and know, which can be nurtured by a loving parent. To me, it's completely insane that we've chosen to outsource our children's education and that we don't trust ourselves to be our children's teachers. And it's also insane that we think they need to be taught social emotional skills like how to go along. This too is something that we have evolved to do, to make friends, to collaborate. This process can happen just as naturally as learning a language. It doesn't need to be forced on children. There are structures that make it more difficult to achieve this. If a family lives in a multi-generational setting, it's much easier to take care of childcare needs. If parents work remotely, it's also much easier to be our child's parent and cultivate the secure attachments that learning naturally springs from. But certainly it isn't easy. However, there are ways to create these conditions to make learning happen more naturally and easily than it would in a traditional school. I'll just add one last thing. I'm not saying there's no value in a child having friends their same age. Ideally, they will have lots of different friends of different ages, including adults. But even developmentally, children don't really need to have those friends until their ages 6 or 7 to basically have people who can kind of empathize with the same things they're going through. And it's quite easy. If your child is 3 or 4 or 8 and wants a friend, just go to the playground. It doesn't have to be complicated. Also, I want to add, I'm not a developmental psychologist. I've taught many children in the capacity as a tutor. I've hung out with hundreds of homeschoolers. I'm someone who just loves children and wants them to be happy and wants there to be more intelligent, thoughtful people in this world. But I really recommend you read the book, Hold On to Your Kids by Gabor Mate and Dr. Neufeld. It will really blow your mind. And just for me, it just completely changed the way I think about social relationships. And just another thing that informs my viewpoint is that I went to a Montessori elementary school where I had lots of friends. In middle school and high school, I went to schools where I had no friends and I was constantly teased and really only made friends during my 3rd year of college when I was traveling abroad. So for me, school did not help me make friends in any way whatsoever. But for some people, maybe it is a good way for them to make friends. So I've been running some surveys on Reddit, and it looks like almost 100% of people choose to homeschool because of something really negative they're experiencing at school. It's very rarely, oh, I'm interested in alternative education, or I want my child to have more one-on-one mastery learning. So I think the school system is really doing our job for us. And as more people start to homeschool, it will become more socially acceptable. And then people will start homeschooling for less drastically negative reasons when they see their friends doing it. I do think that some misguided beliefs around socialization are preventing a number of people from homeschooling who would do so otherwise. So perhaps sharing information about how social capacity actually develops in children and nurturing conditions for that capacity to develop, as well as illustrating how social homeschoolers actually are by sharing their stories,
could be supportive in helping parents to homeschool who want to but are afraid of this socialization issue. Hi, Alicia. I know you asked for a class, but I just want to throw this in there. Jeremy Howard, who is the co-founder of Fast.ai and really great at teaching anybody programming, he and I did a deep dive and tested a bunch of coding apps with his daughter, and we came up with a list of our favorites and how to get started with them. So I'm just going to copy and paste it here, and hopefully you can find something you like. We have Scratch Junior, Scratch, Code.org, and some other great ones, including CodeSpark.
I definitely agree. Our kids are over-socialized and over-scheduled, and that's a parent problem. Scheduling back-to-back-to-back birthday parties on weekends and sporting events and play dates.